Our speakers here, Lubnah, Shomali, and Eitan. I'll introduce Lubnah first. Lubnah's going to speak first. Welcome, Lubnah. Lubnah is the Administrative Financial and Affairs Manager of Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, a Palestinian human rights organization established in 1998, dedicated to defending and promoting the rights of the Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons. A Palestinian human rights defender and activist, Mrs. Shomali, focuses on a comprehensive rights-based approach to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which with a focus on forced population transfer, refugees and internally displaced persons according to international humanitarian and human rights law. So please welcome Lubnah Shomali. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you this morning. صباح الخير للجميع وأهلا وسهلا فيكم. Welcome to the Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign Palestinian Freedom Conference. Today I'm going to talk about or attempt to demystify the right of return. So I'm going to talk about how the basis for the right of return, the foundations of the right of return, and how we can apply this to the Palestinian situation. So we're going to be basically talking about what return looks like in principle and in practice. Why do we need to talk about return and reparations? Because when we talk about the Palestinian people, we're talking about a population that constitutes the largest and longest standing displaced population in the world. Roughly, we're talking about 8.1 million people. 8.1 million Palestinians have faced displacement at least once in their lifetime, with significant numbers having experienced it more than once. This number constitutes 66% of the Palestinian people. So what does this mean, or how can we wrap our heads around this number? Out of every 10 Palestinians you meet, 7 of them will either be a refugee or an IDP, an internally displaced person, or potentially both. So it's very important that when we refer to the issue of Palestine, or the question of Palestine, as the UN likes to call it, that we always talk about one of the core issues, or the most important issue of the conflict, which is the issue of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons. Of course, we cannot escape talking about the role Israel has played in the creation of the Palestinian refugee and IDP population. And Israel is able to maintain, sustain, and augment this displaced population through a number of crimes according to international law. When we talk about the crimes that Israel has and continues to perpetuate in Palestine, we're talking about population transfers, which entail both the forced displacement of the indigenous population of Mandatory Palestine, and we're talking about also the colonization of a foreign settler, the implantation of a settler colonial population in Palestine. And then, of course, one of the third crimes that Israel commits is, of course, apartheid. So we're going to be taking a look at those a little bit in detail. So I'll ask you to bear with me. I know that the Irish people are quite well educated on the issue of Palestine, but I think that the situation or the history does deserve a little bit of mentioning. When we talk about the ongoing forcible transfer, Badil refers to it as the ongoing Nakba. Unfortunately for us, the Nakba is not isolated to what occurred in 1947 to 1949. but rather we have a long history of forced displacement and transfer. This forced displacement and transfer began as early as 1917 with the occupation by the British and the formation of the British Mandate for Palestine. The Irish people, I think, are quite familiar with what occupation looks like and what occupation by the British looks like. While in 1948, during the Nakba, and in 1967, when Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, we saw huge waves of displacement, or huge numbers of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons were created. That doesn't mean that before those periods, in between those periods, and after those periods, there was no displacement or the displacement stopped. So the Nakba is not relegated to just a certain period in time, to a historic period in time. It is, as the Lord Mayor said, something that is ongoing. And so we, in Palestine, we talk about the ongoing Nakba, signifying the ongoing displacement and dispossession. Now, there are different ways that this displacement can occur. I'm going to briefly talk about how it occurred during the actual Nakba and how the Zionist militias were able to ethnically cleanse Palestine from about 750 to about 800,000 Palestinians who eventually became either refugees or internally displaced. And it's nothing new, or it's not new to Israel's strategy. One of the things that they do when they encounter an obstacle is they create a military plan. And so we've seen Israel create numerous military plans in our lifetime, like Operation Cast Lead, Operation Brother's Keeper, and those are the names of the operations of the different wars on Gaza. So 1948 was no different. They created a military plan. At the time, the plan was called Plan Dalet. And Plan Dalet was the first in a series of military plans that was designed to ethnically cleanse Palestine of its indigenous population. Plan Dalet had three major areas of operation. One was the depopulation and subsequent razing of villages. So Zionist militias would enter a Palestinian village or community, force the inhabitants out, and then raze the village to the ground. And over 500 Palestinian villages were depopulated and razed in this way. Another pillar of operation of Plan Dalet was the roundup and shipping out of Palestinians from different areas. So Zionist militias would come into an area, round up the Palestinian population, load them up onto transportation vehicles, and force them out of the area. When transportation vehicles were used, they were supplied by the Zionist militias. And if there were no transportation vehicles available, then the Palestinians would be forced to leave by foot. One example of this happening is in an area called Al-Ramla. You can see it there on the map. It's towards the center there by the coast. In Al-Ramla, about 50,000 Palestinians were rounded up and shipped out by the Zionist militias. This third area of operation of Plan Dalet is what I call strategic massacres. Zionist militias would enter a Palestinian village or community and massacre everyone they could get their hands on. Massacres, about 30 to 40 massacres occurred during the period of the actual Nakba. One example of such a massacre is the massacre of Deir Yassin, which occurred in April of 1948. Zionist militias entered Deir Yassin, which is a small village just outside of Jerusalem, and massacred about 150 to about 200 people from Deir Yassin. No one was left untouched: men, women, children, the elderly, and so on and so forth. It's one of the most well-known massacres committed by the Zionist militias in Palestine, but it's not the only massacre, nor is it the largest massacre. But what was the consequence of such a massacre and other massacres? Well, when other Palestinians found out about what happened in Deir Yassin and in other areas, they didn't stick around and wait for the Zionist militias to get to them and potentially do the same thing. So they fled in fear and terror to other areas. After Plan Dalet and the subsequent military plans, when Palestine had been ethnically cleansed of about, as I said, 750 to about 800,000 Palestinians at that time, which constituted about 60% of the indigenous Palestinian population, they began going to their second strategy. So I mentioned the first strategy, which is military plan or war. The second strategy of the Israeli state is the creation of laws. Now, just because a state creates laws, as you know, it doesn't mean that these laws abide by human rights and international law. And Israel is very adept at creating laws that don't necessarily comply with international law in order to achieve a specific purpose. Once Palestine had been ethnically cleansed, the second step would be to somehow gain control of the land, either legitimately or illegitimately. And so Israel started issuing what they call absentee property laws and military orders. The absentee property law that was issued in, I believe, 1952 basically stated that even though I, Israel, have forcibly displaced you from your homes, and even though I, Israel, prevent you from returning to your homes through another law, which I will discuss later, I, Israel, declare you to be absent. And as an absentee, you forfeit all rights to your property, and your property comes under the custodianship of Israel. And this is how Israel was able to confiscate or legitimize the confiscation of all the property belonging to the Palestinian refugees, those they had displaced outside the area that came to be called Israel. Now, there was a significant number of Palestinians who were displaced internally, what international law calls internally displaced persons. How to deal with their property rights, and this is where Israel starts to get even more creative. They created what was called the present absentee clause. And the present absentee clause basically states that even though I know you are here, you are present, I'm still going to declare you absent, and therefore, as an absentee, you forfeit all rights to your property, and your property comes under the custodianship of Israel. By using the absentee property law and the present absentee clause, Israel was founded upon 78% of mandatory Palestine. That's 78% belonging to Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons. So they dealt very well with, or they were very successful with, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and they were subsequently also very successful with controlling the property or controlling the land. So now the final task that was left to them was to colonize the newly acquired territory with the desired population. And here is where we have, or where we see, the Zionist movement, which is a political ideology and is a secular political ideology, hijack a religious denomination, which is Judaism, in order to justify the forcible cleansing or the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the colonization of Jews in Palestine, the colonization of Palestine with Jews from around the world. Members of the Zionist movement went to religious Jews around the world and told them, I'm not telling you to come to Palestine. God is telling you to come to Palestine. You are the chosen people. This is the promised land. Come and make the deserts bloom, and so on and so forth. So here we have a situation which is not new to us and will probably happen again, where a political movement or ideology hijacked a religion, in this case Judaism, in order to further their political goals. What did they do on the ground? Again, they created a law called the Law of Return. Now, this should not be confused with the international right of return. This is the Israeli Law of Return. And the Israeli Law of Return basically states that any Jew from anywhere around the world, and only a Jew, can come and live or return to Palestine. Now, there is a situation, a very a very bad situation with this law. In international law, if you put into law or if you institutionalize something that is inherently racist by putting it into law, there's a specific word that's used for it. One of the, how this is categorized is called institutionalized discrimination, but the more common word that is used for this type of law is called apartheid, the big A word, right? So with the law of return, Israel created one of its most prominent and most impactful apartheid laws because it granted return, which is a right that belongs to everyone, to those of a specific religious denomination and disregarded the right of return for others. So they created a very exclusive law, okay, within Israeli law. And this is one of Israel's apartheid laws. We'll be talking about one more. What does the ongoing Nakba look like? In addition to those laws that I just talked about, there are a whole host of laws and military orders that create a situation in which Palestinians really have no choice but to leave. It's not as obvious as the type of force that is created from armed and violent conflict, which is what we saw in 1948 and 1967, what we saw during the wars on Gaza, what we're seeing in Syria, what's going on with Saudi Arabia and Yemen, what's happened in Iraq and continues to happen in Iraq. That's one of the ways to create this force. Another way to create this force is the creation of a coercive environment, the creation of a situation that is so unbearable that people have no choice but to leave. It's not as obvious as the force that is created by armed and violent conflict, and yet it is recognized by force according to international law. This coercive environment is often created by the denial of very fundamental freedoms, like access to adequate housing, access to adequate living, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, access to water, access to health care and education, and so on and so forth. So we categorized basically 9 policies that Israel uses to forcibly displace Palestinians today on both sides of the Green Line, not just in the territory occupied in 1967, but also the territory occupied in 1948. For more information on these policies, I encourage you to go to our website and read about it. For example, installment of a permit regime. There are over 101 different permits that Israel issues, but more likely does not issue to Palestinians for things like movement, access to health care, building, development, visitors, the kind of permit that Mazyuna would need to come and see her son, for example, would fall under this regime. The other policies include land confiscation and denial of use, discriminatory zoning and planning, denial of access to natural resources and services, suppression of resistance, the role of non-state actors. We talked a little bit about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and how we are trying to get corporations to uphold international law and human rights when they operate in the occupied territory. The denial of reparations, the denial of return, which is something that I'm going to talk about in more depth. But I'd like to mention the Prevention of Infiltration Law of 1954, which is another Israeli law. So shortly after the cessation of armed conflict in 1948, thousands of Palestinians attempted to return. This created a very embarrassing situation for the newly formed state. And they recognized that allowing the Palestinians to return would defeat the purpose and all the efforts that they had just put forth to ethnically cleanse Palestine. So they created the Prevention of Infiltration Law, which came onto the Israeli law books in 1954, but was actually implemented retroactively. The Prevention of Infiltration Law basically states that any individual attempting to enter Palestine illegally will be deemed an infiltrator, and an infiltrator will be dealt with in 3 ways by this law. The first way is that they would be shot on sight, and thousands of Palestinians attempting to return after the Nakba were shot on sight by the then Israeli military. The second way is that they would be arrested and detained for 2-year terms that could be renewed at the whim of the state. Thousands more were arrested and detained. The third way would be that they would be arrested and forced back into exile or deported, and thousands more were arrested and forced back into exile. So with the law of return and the prevention of infiltration law, Israel effectively halted the return of Palestinian refugees on their own. So they were stopped from seeking return or implementing return on their own by the implementation of these 2 Israeli laws. Another Israeli law worth mentioning, which is another apartheid law, is the Israeli nationality law. Now, in most modern nation states, if you're a citizen of the state, you're also a national of the state. And being a citizen and being a national are the same thing. I also happen to have, in addition to my Palestinian nationality, I also have American citizenship. My passport says Lubnah is a citizen/national of the United States of America, meaning that in the US, as in most modern nation states, citizen and national are one and the same. This is not the case for Israel, okay? There's a huge difference between being a citizen of Israel and being a national of Israel. Nationality is reserved for those the state considers Jewish, and it is the higher legal status within Israeli law, meaning that more rights and privilege are associated with being a national of Israel. Others, the non-Jews, are provided with citizenship status, which is an inferior status within Israeli law because less rights are associated with being a citizen of Israel. Now, the non-Jews of Israel, who do they comprise? Palestinians, the Muslims, the Druze, the Palestinian Christians who remained in what came to be called Israel after Israel was established on Palestine. The Israeli nationality law, again, sets up this separation or segregation based on religious denomination, thus making it another Israeli apartheid law. And the final category or the final policy is denial of residency. Now, most people associate denial of residency with Palestinians living in Jerusalem, but in reality, Israel has or has taken the authority to be able to deny residency to just about anyone or grant residency to those that they want to grant residency to. So, for example, after the occupation of the rest of Palestine in 1967, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were abroad before that occupation. And then Israel occupied the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza. Those individuals had been abroad studying, visiting relatives, vacationing, working, and so on and so forth. When they attempted to return, Israel did not allow them back in. So if they effectively denied them residency and made them refugees as well. So what Israel has done is created a legal hierarchy that controls every single Palestinian regardless of where they reside around the world. At the top of the legal hierarchy, we have Jewish nationals who have ultimate rights and privilege according to Israeli law. Underneath that, we have Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, and the Israeli nationality law divides between those two groups based on religious denomination. In addition to the Israeli nationality law, there are about 50 to 60 laws that grant rights to Jewish nationals, but not to citizens. Then we have Palestinians residing in Jerusalem who are considered resident aliens in their own city. Then we have West Bank ID holders, even lower legal status. Gaza ID holders, even lower legal status within Israeli law. And then at the very bottom, we have Palestinian refugees, both in Palestine and abroad, who have absolutely no rights according to Israeli law. Since Israel is the perpetrator of these crimes, the crimes of population transfer, both forced displacement and transfer, and colonization, and the crime of apartheid, Israel is then obligated to provide reparations. The obligation for reparations is a practice. Not only is it a legal obligation contained within many international treaties and conventions, but it also has been reiterated by the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, or the World Court, as well as by many other judicial bodies. It is understood that the obligation for reparations arises when a state fails to fulfill its obligations under international law. So if a state commits gross human rights violations and crimes, then they are obligated to provide reparations. And the principal right available to victims, or to what victims are entitled to under international law, is the right to effective remedies and just reparations. Note that the statement says effective remedies, not just any remedies, and just reparations, so not just any reparations. So what does that look like? Oh, I'm sorry. Again, why reparations besides the legal obligation that Israel has, or any state perpetuating gross violations and crimes under international law? One reason reparations was created within the international law frameworks is because it serves as a deterrence. It deters states, or it's intended to deter states from taking actions or committing or doing things that would lead to displacement and transfer of peoples. Another reason reparations was created is on the principle of equity, that countries should not benefit from situations in which there are gross human rights violations and crimes being committed. A third reason for reparations is that it restores some of the dignity to those that have faced or did face displacement and transfer. Another reason, of course, is to reduce the financial burdens on the international community and the victims themselves, though the state perpetuating the crimes and the human rights violations needs to be held financially accountable. And then finally, in order to achieve reconciliation, reparations should be incorporated in a more extensive package of reconciliation. Here we're talking about recognition for the wrongdoing, like formal apologies, as well as transitional justice mechanisms, awareness raising, and so on and so forth. So what is reparations? Reparations technically means, within international law, the restoration as much as possible to what once was. And there are four main components within reparations, the right to reparations. Voluntary repatriation, which is return, physical return. Please note that it's voluntary, and forced return, of course, is illegal according to international law. Property restitution, the reclamation of the original property lost wherever possible. Compensation, when the reclamation of the original property is not always possible. It could be monetary, or it could be other property. And then, of course, satisfaction, including guarantees of non-repetition. Reparations in practice, or what we need to have happen in order for reparations to be successful. Badil and other organizations in the past about 10, 15 years visited a number of countries in which there was mass displacement as well as return. So we went on missions to Cyprus, former Yugoslavia, which is now Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also former apartheid South Africa, to learn from those reparations mechanisms what worked and what didn't work. Successful reparations mechanisms in practice need to have detailed political agreements that ensure the individual rights of the victims and repeal any discriminatory legislation. And then, of course, this repeal needs to be monitored and enforced. One of the issues with Oslo is that it has no the peace agreement between Palestine and Israel, or the PLO and Israel, is that it has no rights-based foundations. There is no mention of the collective or individual inalienable rights of the Palestinian people within that peace agreement. And it does not address the colonial and apartheid nature of Israel. And so, yes, of course, Oslo was doomed to fail. And here we are, 25 years after Oslo, experiencing its most resolute failure. Rights holders, the victims, Palestinian refugees, and IDPs, internally displaced persons, need to participate in creating the reparations mechanism and process. Of course, this mechanism and process needs international support and backing, because we know that Israel is not going to wake up one morning and say, oh, geez, we need to provide Palestinians with reparations for the wrong that we have done. I mean, we all know that that's not going to happen anytime soon. And so we need the international support and political backing of the international community, not just states, but individuals, international civil society as well. We need to have a comprehensive legislative framework with a review mechanism so that we can monitor the reparations process, because it's not going to be something that happens overnight. It's something that's going to be happening systematically in an organized way over a number of years. And we need to create a system of return and restitution grounded in international law. And in the most successful reparations mechanisms, restitution, property restitution, needs to be favored over pure compensation. This is for many reasons, because one, justice is more effectively dealt in this way, and we can erase the spatial domination of Palestine by providing Palestinian refugees and IDPs with their original properties and lands. And two, it's more financially viable than a pure compensation mechanism. Now, I do have more to say, but how am I doing on time? I'm done. Yeah. I can stop there, and then in the Q&A I can take questions. Yeah, I know that we're kind of, okay.
That's if you would, yeah.
5 minutes?
Yeah, if you would.
I'll take it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I don't talk too much, do I? Yeah, I know. Okay. All right. So, what are the challenges, or rather, what are the Israeli talking points that they put forth in order to say that we can't do reparations? One is they talk about self-determination, the self-determination of the Israeli Jewish population or civil society living in Palestine today. Another issue that they say is that with the return of Palestinian refugees, they're going to come in like a swarm of angry bees and drive the Jews into the sea. So they worry about property restitution and the issue of secondary occupancy. Israeli Jews who are residing in homes and lands that belong to refugees, what's going to happen to them? And another thing that they claim as a challenge is the issue of the security of Israel and the stability of the society and the economy. I mean, how can we let Palestinian refugees and IDPs back in? What will that do? It will create mass conflict, and it will create a crash in the economy. How can we survive it, et cetera, the numbers, and so on and so forth. The issue of self-determination. Self-determination is a collective right that is supposed to be accessible within a framework to facilitate other rights. The right to self-determination does not sanction or require the division of states. So when the UN decided, oh, let's partition Palestine, in order to be able to give a certain group of people their right to access self-determination, it wasn't necessarily necessary, because self-determination can be satisfied through a democratic self-government within a pre-existing territory. In other words, if we have a democratic, non-discriminatory political framework in place, or government in place, or constitution, or institutions, then all individuals would be able to exercise their right of self-determination within such a framework. And finally, it should be noted that self-determination is never a license or a justification for artificially changing the demographic composition of a certain entity or privileging the rights of a certain group of people over another. And that's exactly what Israel did when they created, or the Zionist movement did when they created Israel. And Israel continues to perpetuate this change of the demographic composition and the domination of one group of people over another. Property restitution versus secondary occupants. Palestinian refugees and IDPs as victims of a discriminatory state-sponsored land regime. You recall I talked about the absentee property law and the present absentee clause, and there are many other laws and military orders in place that allow Israel to take Palestinian land. All of these people, all of these who have been subject to this discriminatory land regime, have a right to reparations from Israel, okay? The means by which the land is acquired is important. Was the land acquired in good faith? This is international law talking. If the land was acquired in good faith, then the secondary occupant is also entitled to compensation, meaning the Israeli Jew who was placed in the home of a Palestinian by the state is eligible for compensation from Israel as well. If the land wasn't acquired in good faith, then that group or individual is also responsible for providing reparation. The occupancy rights, or the acquired rights of Israeli civil society, should not impede the Palestinian right to reparations or right to return. And situations in which Israeli Jews need to leave a Palestinian home or area, the government or the political framework that is created for the purpose of reparations would have to provide alternative housing. So no, it's not about driving the Jews into the sea, but making sure that the acquired rights and the inalienable rights, the acquired rights of Israeli Jews and the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people are both fulfilled. Security and stability. Reparations was created specifically to address the root causes of conflict, namely the crimes that lead to displacement and transfer, that lead to the creation of refugees and IDPs. So in order to address these root causes, the colonialism, the apartheid, the forcible transfer, reparations is necessary in order to create a situation in which all parties can live in security and instability. Without addressing the root causes of the problem through a durable and just reparations mechanism, then we will continue to see a situation that is similar to the situation that we see today, the ongoing displacement of the Palestinian people, further colonization or the entrenchment of more settler colonialism, as well as the entrenchment of an apartheid regime. And I think I'll stop there. Okay.